Λοιπόν, θέλω να σας παρουσιάσω τον καθηγητή κύριο Μίλλερ. Ο Στέφανος Μίλλερ ήρθε στην Ελλάδα ως σπουδαστής το 1967 και συμμετείχε στις ανασκαφές στην Ολυμπία και μετά στην αρχαία αγορά των Αθηνών. Το 1973 εντάχθηκε στο διδακτικό προσωπικό του Πανεπιστημίου της Καλιφόρνια και ανέλαβε τις προετοιμασίες στην Nemea, όπου άρχισε σημαντικές ανασκαφές το 1974. Στην Nemea, εκτός από τις πολλές αποκαλύψεις του περιλαμβανομένου του αρχαίου σταδίου, δημιούργησε ένα αρχαιολογικό πάρκο, κατασκεύασε μουσείο και άρχισε την αναστήλωση του ναού του Νεμείου Διός. Τώρα, συνταξιοδοτημένος πλέον από το Berkeley, ο Μίλλερ ζει στην αρχαία Nemea και διοικεί το Σύλλογο για την αναβίωση των Νεμαίων Αγώνων. Κύριε Μίλλερ.
Ευχαριστώ. Κυρίες και κύριοι, θέλω καταρχάς να ευχαριστήσω το culent για την ευκαιρία να μοιραστώ μαζί σας μία πρόταση που έκανε πρόσφατα για την ενίσχυση των αρκετήτων της Ελλάδας. Δεν υπάρχει αρκετός χρόνος να σας την εξηγήσω πλήρως, αλλά υπάρχουν αντίγραφα, δυστυχώς το έχουμε στις θέσεις, και ελπίζω ότι θα πάρετε μαζί σας και να εξετάζετε την πρόταση μου με την ησυχία σας. Τώρα ζητάω την ευκαιρία σας για να μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. Την μητρική γλώσσα μου θέλω να είμαι βέβαιος ότι σας λέω αυτό που θέλω να σας πω. I propose to give you just one of many, many possible examples of why I have made this proposal about the antiquities of Greece. For more than 40 years, I have lived and now I've worked and now live in the valley of ancient Nemea, which we see here from the east. That valley is bounded on the west by the hill of Prophetess Athens. And on the other side of Prophetess Athens is the much larger valley of Nemea, New Nemea, or in antiquity, Phlius. That valley, the valley of Phlius, seen from the top of Prophetess Athens, has the capital city of Nemea at the southwestern corner, here at the left. It produces the wine known today as Maria-Louiza, but in antiquity as Phliasian wine. The name of the wine came from the city, which was on the ridge which dominated the plain at its northeastern corner. That ridge which juts out from Prophetess Athens into the valley. Today, Phlius, whose ancient acropolis is marked by the mid-Byzantine church of Maria-Louiza, has given its name to the region and is still surrounded by vineyards. Ancient Phlius did not produce only wine, but also had a role at the beginning of Greek drama, for two Phliasians, Pratinus and Aristius, father and son, invented and developed the satyr play, appropriate to a homeland so intertwined with Dionysus. Ancient critics thought that the Phliasians, Pratinus and Aristius, were second only to Aeschylus in the satyr play. Since we know the role of wine in symposia and the philosophical discussions that frequently arose from there, we are entitled to wonder if Dionysus also played a role in another phenomenon to be observed at Phlius, a continuing presence of known philosophers in the classical period. They begin with Pythagoras, whose ancestors were said to be from Phlius. According to Cicero, Pythagoras returned to his ancestral land in the late 6th century, and during a discussion with the local tyrant, identified himself as a philosophos. The first recorded example of the use of the word philosophos was born in Phlius. In the 5th century, a school of Pythagoreanism was established in Phlius by exiles from Croton after the death of Pythagoras, probably including Philolaus, a mathematician and astronomer whose treatise was used by Plato in his Timaeus. Indeed, in Plato's Phaedon, Epictetus of Phlius comes to inquire about the death of Socrates. We hear that Epictetus, together with Phanto, Diocles, and Polygnostos, all of Phlius, were the last of the Pythagoreans. The Phliasian ties to philosophy do not, however, end there, for Timon of Phlius was perhaps the best known of the skeptics in the 3rd century, but already in the 4th century came Axiotea, a woman who dressed as a man in order to enter the academy and study with Plato. Near the end of the 4th century, another Phleasian, Asclepiades, also went to Athens to study philosophy. Although Phleas seems to have avoided most political and military endeavors, it did contribute 200 soldiers to Thermopylae and 1,000 to Plataea. It must have had a reasonably large population. Indeed, Xenophon tells us that in 381 BC there were more than 5,000 men of military age in Phleas. As we see the ancient site on the ridge to the right that I've already pointed out to you, and the modern city to the left, it is interesting to note that on May the 18th, just passed, the modern city of Nemea had just under 8,000 registered voters. That 8,000 number included women and the scattered villages that are part of the modern city. In other words, the population of ancient Phleas approached and even surpassed that of modern Nemea. Few topographical details of ancient Phleas are known, but they are suggestive of a sizable and well-oriented city. The visible remains today are first and foremost the Church of the Maria-Louiza that we have already mentioned. At the end of the ridge, coming down into the valley, the theater, and a very large building in front of it, the Palati, as it is called today, the end of which is marked by a single tree. We will come back to the tree. Despite those few antiquities, and thanks to Pausanias, we can form a somewhat fuller picture. The ancient traveler begins, it seems, high on the Acropolis, where he lists, as he comes down the ridge, a sacred grove of cypress trees and a sanctuary of Hebe, a temple of Hera with a statue of Parian marble, a temple with statues of Demeter and her daughter, and a bronze statue of Artemis, a temple of Asclepius, and below the temple of Asclepius, a theater. Not far from the theater, a sanctuary of Demeter with old seated statues. In the agora, a bronze gilt she-goat. Also in the agora, a monument of Aristius, son of Cratinus, whom we mentioned before. Behind the agora, a divination building, Ikos Mantikos, where after spending the night, Amphiaraus began to see the future. Then there comes what is called the Ophilos, the center of the whole Peloponnesus, if the Phleasians are correct. Further on, there is an ancient sanctuary of Dionysus, then a sanctuary of Apollo, then a sanctuary of Isis. And next to the sanctuary of Apollo is a building with stone statues of Kiathos holding out a cup to Heracles. In other words, there was a large and well-decorated town. Most people have believed, scholars, that as Pausanias comes out of the theater, he turns toward the east into this area at the foot of the Acropolis, where we should think of the agora and many of these buildings that he's listed to be found. A map of Phleas made by a team led by Jim Wright, now the director of the American School, shows the blocks of architecture that were scattered all over the fields. Part of the eastern fortification wall has been identified here, and the Maria-Louiza, the theater, and the Palati form fixed points. The concentration of architectural elements to the southeast of the Palati suggests that the agora and its associated monuments are to be sought here, just as I've already indicated. The Maria-Louiza is built on top of a structure which could be the temple of Asclepius or the temple of Demeter and Hera. Whatever the proper identification, the church rests on top of massive ancient foundations which extend to the north toward us, but which have never been published and are now overgrown. The walls of the church itself consist of massive ancient blocks, presumably from the building originally on the ancient foundations which now support the church. There are other impressive architectural monuments no longer in their original place. In the museum in ancient Nemea are several nicely worked blocks from a wall that was 77 centimeters thick. They bear inscriptions that were wrought on the face of that wall, ranging in date from the 6th century BC, as we see here, to the 1st century after Christ. The theater is well preserved, relatively well preserved, only in the Proedria, and very well-built, thick retaining wall on the eastern side of the cavity. Otherwise, rough cuttings indicate the area of the seats, and the bedrock is cut down vertically on the west, where are the remains of a pipe-style hall, which is now overgrown. The orchestra seems never to have been a full circle, and its orientation to the Skene building is curious. The Skene is incompletely excavated, and its western end is unknown, and therefore its full dimensions are unknown. Behind it, and not aligned directly with it, are two stone foundations, which we will return to in a moment. Finally, there is the so-called palati, the north wall of which has been rocked out with the overall dimensions of about 25 by 33 meters, and the basis for an interior colonnade are clear. The function of the building is not known, but something like an assembly hall or utilitarian comes to mind. It is time now to tour the site. On the Acropolis is the now familiar church of Maria-Louiza. At the left, one can make out a little bit of the theater, and closer are the well-shaped, massive blocks of the substructure of the palati. On the far side of the palati, and outside the fence, is a relatively recently constructed house of the owner of the adjacent fields. Inside the palati, the interior column bases are clear, and one can see the proedria of the theater in the background. The farmhouse is also visible, as is its vineyard. Can it be doubted that, say, the farmhouse and the vineyard are on top of antiquities? Can it be doubted that the cultivation of those vineyards harm the antiquities? Closer to the theater, as we approach the back wall of the Skene, seen here at the upper right corner, we see two stone structures, which I mentioned earlier. They're now filled with earth and weeds, but the iron clamps which hold them together are still in place. Here they are 40 years ago, characterized by the sloping floor down into the base of the structures and the semicircular grooves on the top of their side walls. What are they? Thomas Quandus and his colleagues from the University of Patras had understood that they served as a part of the base for a crane, the mechanism used to produce the deus ex machina, the god who hovered over the stage from above to solve problems in ancient Greek drama. Phlius provides a very rare example of physical evidence for that machine. Here is the proedria of the theater in its current condition. Note that the fence surrounding the archaeological site excludes the remainder of the theater up the hill to the left, as well as the farmhouse which lies just beyond the retaining wall of the cavity. Can there be any doubt that the house, with its wall-thrust, lies directly over a part of ancient Phlius? The fence of the archaeological site continues from the theater down along the west side of the palati. You see the palati here, the fence right next to it, but goes over the top of the end of the Skene, unexcavated end of the Skene. This aerial photograph, taken less than 4 years ago, shows how the fence runs along the west side of the palati, then veers off to catch the end of the proedria that cuts over the top of the Skene, the end of which may be indicated by a relative lack of weeds in this area, but certainly it lies outside the archaeological zone. The fence then continues behind the proedria, as we see, down the east side of the palati, and comes down closer to the tree that I mentioned several times that's at the end of the palati. You can just perhaps make out beneath the palati some stone thrones. We return to the west side of the palati, where the fence hugs the wall and crosses over the top of the ancient block, which is partly inside the archaeological site and partly outside. How many more antiquities lie outside the fence, totally unprotected? The situation in 1973 is to be seen here with the incompletely excavated orchestra in Skene. But I want to call your attention particularly again to the tree at the far end and these white dots, which are four stone thrones, which were recovered in 1924 in the fields to the southeast of the palati and brought here in 1924 for safety. And they were safe for 90 years. Please note the throne in the back with the channel in the seat and its neighbor with the hole in the back. Here they are in their present condition. Now in the grounds of the Archaeological Museum of Ancient Nemea at Tulane. About a year ago, someone entered the site of Phlius and smashed it. The pieces have been collected and await conservation, but the damage is all too clear. How did the smasher get to the thrones, which were then, as for nearly a century, under the tree at the north end of the palata? He walked through the gate. I've never seen it closed. And indeed, there's a local shepherd who takes his flock in through that same gate and on top of the palata to graze. They keep the weeds down, but they do some other things on top of the antiquities as well. Phlius, in other words, has produced significant antiquities, and it clearly has the potential to shed much more light on ancient Greece if protected, preserved, and excavated. But it must be obvious that the state lacks the resources to preserve or protect or excavate. As we look down on Phlius one last time, I suspect that you now recognize the tree at the end of the palata. Let me share with you a dream. In that dream, all the property is bounded on the north by the Acropolis, on the west by the main road that goes through the valley, on the south by a country road that comes through the fields, and on the east by a lane that cuts through other fields. All of that property has been acquired in the name of the Greek state by a private company which will fence the area and provide guards. The farmhouse and the sheepfold will disappear. And scientific excavations will take place again at the expense of the company, but under the direct supervision of the ministry. A museum to house and conserve and exhibit these discoveries will be built, perhaps near a winery off to the south of the site, again at the expense of the company. Obviously, a very large investment will be needed, and the company will sell tickets to people who want to come and watch the excavations in progress, albeit from a distance. The gift shop in the museum will sell artifacts of the discoveries, so that a visitor who has watched a particular artifact come out of the earth for the first time in 3,000 years will come back next year and find replicas of that artifact so that he can buy copies of his discovery. A hotel will be needed to accommodate these visitors. This green will provide steady and relevant employment to the many young Greek archaeologists who are well trained but now have no hope of finding an archaeological position. It will provide employment for guards and guides and gardeners, and they will all pay taxes, as will the company itself when it begins to make a profit. Best of all, the steady destruction of the antiquities will be halted. Furthermore, this ongoing problem of destruction can be confronted and solved at dozens of other ancient sites by the implementation of this green. And finally, the antiquities can come to be regarded as a resource and not an impediment to progress. This green has received much negative criticism. Please read the proposal and decide if the criticism is justified. And also, please remember that the antiquities of Greece are a treasure, but a non-renewable treasure. The E4 of Antiquities of the Corinthia has said publicly that I am trying to destroy Greek archaeology. I would simply ask, when all the antiquities have been destroyed, will there be any Greek archaeology?